Hi, I'm Harriet Frew, eating disorder therapist, teacher and podcaster, and you're about to start healing from your eating disorder and transforming your life and your relationship with food and body. I've worked in NHS and private practice supporting clients for 20 years, and I believe that recovery is possible for you. This podcast dives into expert interviews, evidence-based psychological approaches, and anecdotal tips from the therapy room from my years of experience. If you're wanting to heal your relationship with food, feel confident in your body, develop self-love and self-acceptance, and create a life of freedom and meaning, then this podcast is for you. Thank you for being here. Today I'm talking to Brooke Carlson, an eating disorder therapist and licensed professional clinical counsellor working primarily with adolescents and young adults and based in Minnesota, USA. Brooke has worked for a nationwide eating disorder treatment centre for 3 years called the Emily Programme, and she was an outpatient therapist and partial hospitalisation programme coordinator during that time, whilst also running a recovery support group. Prior to this, Brooke worked at a university counselling centre where she found her passion for working with students and eating disorders. Brooke now works in private practice as an eating disorder expert and sees clients daily. She's also an eating disorder ambassador for the state, where she helps with social media and petitioning for Congress and legislation for more resources and care for eating disorders in the state. She currently has her own business called Brooke Carlson Therapy Services, and she also independently contracts at Wholehearted Healing, LLC in Wayzata, Minnesota. Brooke has never personally suffered with an eating disorder. However, she has struggled with her own disordered eating and body image distress, and she brings this experience with compassion and understanding to her therapy work. Brooke has been on the podcast twice before, and her episodes are proved to be extremely popular. She's talked about over-exercise and eating disorders in athletes, and also the relationship between social media and eating disorders. The links to those episodes are in the show notes. So today, Brooke is back to discuss how grief can be a function in eating disorders. So she's going to name the different types of grief and the different types of losses you can experience, as grief is a type of trauma. She's going to explain how eating disorders are a form of coping and how a focus on food and body can be soothing or numbing from grief, or even a way to express pain from grief. Brooke explains how an eating disorder can even be a way to not feel lonely or as alone if you're going through your own grief. She then goes on to talk about the different griefs we can notice in recovery. For example, the grief of accepting that you can't do treatment alone and that you need a community. The grief of pausing on life, school, work, etc. to go into treatment to get your life back. The grief of realizing that your eating disorder doesn't serve you anymore, even if it did at some point. The grief of life without your eating disorder, and the grief of your past self when maybe you've lost your authentic self to the eating disorder, and the grief of losing your past body or your pre-post recovery body. So you know you're going to really enjoy this thought-provoking episode as Brooke really dives into the deeper issues underneath an eating disorder here. Let's get to the conversation. Hi, Brooke. Welcome back to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast.
Hi, Harriet. So good to see you. Thank you so much for having me back today.
Oh, well, great to have you, Brooke, because I know you've been on the podcast twice already. I think once talking about eating disorders and athletes and exercise, and also once talking about eating disorders and social media. And I know 2 last episodes have been really, really popular. So thank you so much for coming back again.
It's a blast being here. There's a reason why I keep coming back. So thanks again for having me. And I hope this episode's going to be a hit as well.
So Brooke, you've recently set up your own practice, is that right? Alongside the other work that you're doing?
Yeah, that's right. So this last year, I started my own business called Brooke Carlson Therapy Services, PLLC. I started that in 2024. So that's new and very exciting. And I have that. And then I also independently contract with a wonderful group practice in Wayzata, Minnesota called Wholehearted Healing, LLC. So I do both together, and it's been a great time so far.
Oh, brilliant. How's the kind of new practice going? How is it like having your own baby, your own thing?
It's been really great. It was a little stressful at first just because it's a lot to do and it's a lot of learning, but it's learning that's been super beneficial, and I've had wonderful support along the way. And it's been cool to create something from start to finish. And where I do my group practice at Wholehearted Healing, I get to work with other coworkers who I've known for many years. So it's kind of like a little family too, full of therapists and dietitians. So coming back home. So it's great to have both parts.
Oh,
Okay, well, that's good to hear. And is your own practice, is that just you or have you got a team with you?
I'm like my own employee and boss for my own business. And then I independently contract with Wholehearted Healing LLC with other people who have their own businesses too. So we're our own thing, but then we all come together as like a group practice too. So it's a little bit of both.
Sure, no, nice. Okay. So, Brooke, today you're coming back to talk a bit about grief and eating disorders, which I think is like a fascinating topic. And I know before we went live, I was just sort of saying that I don't think we've ever really talked specifically about grief and eating disorders. Thank you for suggesting it because you sort of got in touch, didn't you? And said that was something that's come up a lot in your practice in the last year and you've been working on with your clients. So I really appreciate you kind of bringing that topic to the listeners today.
Oh, yeah, of course. It's been a wonderful experience exploring this with clients, almost like this interconnectedness of how grief or loss, and we can kind of talk a little bit more about what that means later, how that experience can begin an eating disorder, but also on this other kind of side too of how we can notice different types of grief that can come up within recovery too. So it's been like this cool dual practice with clients. And I find that clients really enjoy this. It's hard work, I'd say, but this is kind of an area where I feel like clients truly resonate with it. And in the therapy journey, it can be so amazing. So I'm just glad to share my passion with someone today.
Oh, fantastic. Firstly, could you sort of introduce us a bit to the topic of grief and perhaps talk about the different types of grief and different types of losses that we can experience?
Absolutely. So grief can look and feel like many different things. I think oftentimes we think that grief means a passing or a death of a loved one, and that's 100% for sure grief. But there's also lots of different types of grief too. There's griefs that are tangible and intangible. There's griefs and loss that can happen for ourselves or for someone else, but then we feel that impact kind of like vicariously. And this might be things like grief of ourself or grief of ideas, grief of where we are today, or grief of like a vision, just to kind of more broaden like the spectrum of grief. And all griefs are valid. There's not like a hierarchy of grief. It's all truly valid. And it's something that everyone experiences at some point in their life. And I'll be more specific later about what specific griefs do we maybe notice in eating disorder recovery. But a wonderful resource I always use with my clients is this book. It's called What's Your Grief? And it's by Haley and Williams. It is a wonderful psychoeducation book that breaks down all the different types of griefs. And it's super informational. It feels incredibly validating and it's beautifully illustrated. So usually when I'm talking about this section with clients, I'll often have them read that book just so they can have a better understanding of grief too. And they can kind of find where do they localize. So I would always recommend like that book first.
Sure. So did you say that's called What's Your Grief?
What's Your Grief by Haley Williams. I can actually email you after this and send you the link to it. It's great. Highly recommend.
Oh, no, thank you so much for that. Because I think, as you were saying, we do often associate grief with a bereavement or a death, often, don't we? I think often as we don't sort of expand our understanding of grief beyond that. And perhaps then we often overlook the different losses and the grieving that's going on in our lives.
Absolutely. And I think clients too can sometimes feel like this abundance of sadness or like this heaviness within themselves on their heart and intense emotions, emotional dysregulation. And when we just name, like, hey, this kind of sounds like grief, it sounds like a loss here in whatever kind of context we're talking about. And clients will oftentimes really relate to that, like, oh my gosh, that's like the best way to put it. That's where I think this is a hard topic to talk about because it's very vulnerable and it's kind of almost going into like deeper layers of emotional work and recovery, but one that I think almost every client can have that connection to and they find it very worthwhile.
So would you describe grief as a type of trauma?
I actually have that underlined on my notes. Yes, I definitely would say that grief and all the different types of grief that we've named earlier can be a type of trauma. There's that devastation, there's that absolute heartbreak, there's like an event or a belief or life circumstances that people just remember for the rest of their lives. And I think that can be considered like a trauma. And as we know, with eating disorders and trauma, they often intertwine with each other, very much so. And that eating disorders have like a function in some way. And that's where I think grief or loss can almost be a manifestation of an eating disorder, because given whatever that client is going through and experiencing, they might experience depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, even PTSD, depending on what happened. And with all those profound feelings and struggles, a lot of clients can have lack of appetite or just this intense, big emotions that they can feel really out of control. And that's sometimes where it's unintentional, usually unintentional, where eating disorder symptoms then come up, whether that be with restriction, over exercising, purging, even to maybe try to control what's going on if their grief was something totally out of their scope, out of their control, that might happen, or that restriction or compensation behavior might be a way to numb their experience for whatever's going on. Even the flip side of how binging could even happen, where with their grief of binging might be a way to soothe themselves, try to make themselves feel better from their grief or loss. Or maybe it's even a way to escape their loss, or depending what happened, to try to find joy. And that's where food can come in for people. That's where we can really find how eating disorders can be a way to cope with someone's grief.
I think it's so helpful to shine a light on this, because we often look more to the surface, don't we, with eating disorders? I mean, I think you and I as therapists, we understand it's often about much deeper things, but it can very much seem that it's all about food and body image and the number on the scales. But actually, when you're just talking, then you're talking about someone using disordered eating behaviors as a way to like numb, to soothe, to maybe express their pain, to distract. It's a coping strategy, isn't it? They're getting some relief, I guess, in the short term from using these strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And even to add to that too, I think sometimes these behaviors can help someone feel not as alone or not as lonely. If they feel so isolated from what their grief or loss is, that this in a way can make them feel like there's someone else or something else there. It also might be an attempt to try to signal like, hey, I'm not doing well. I'm really struggling over here. Kind of like what you said of expressing pain in some way. It's always like that iceberg kind of model of it's not just always what you see on top, it's something so much more. And oftentimes it's so much more complex and intertwined and much more real and vulnerable.
Yeah, I know, so true. And I think it's a great point about people feeling perhaps less alone when they have their eating disorder, because I think it's very hard sometimes, isn't it, from someone from the outside looking in, can feel very confusing. Like, why would someone want to cling to an eating disorder as a coping strategy? Why are they doing all of these things? But if they're feeling really lonely and isolated and misunderstood and just very alone in their grief, it can be something to kind of hold on to, can't it? Because you're kind of in a relationship with the disorder itself.
Exactly. And when it's a relationship and when you view it like that, although it's something that has harm to it, it's a thing that almost makes you feel like you have company, or it's a thing that's there in some way to look forward to, or it's something that's part of your day when you feel like you have that loss and that grief and right to a loved one or a family member. You want to rationalize with them of like, there is so much more. We're here for you, support and all the skills and everything. And when you're really stuck, it feels like this is kind of like what you're clinging on to. And that's just where I think grief and eating disorders then can almost just merge together and form this disordered eating for some people.
Time for a short advertisement break. I want to tell you about Mindy Gorman-Plutzer. She is a board-certified integrative health coach, certified eating psychology coach, and certified functional nutrition counsellor. In 2012, she created the Freedom Promise in an effort to help clients transform their relationship with food from one mired in fear and confusion to one that is loving, nourishing, and sustainable. Inspired by her own recovery journey, she developed a signature system comprised of 7 steps.
The framework offers an alternative approach to recovery as it's aligned with the principles of functional medicine. All systems are connected, everybody is unique, and everything matters. She guides you to listen to the wisdom of your body so you discover an empowering nutrition and lifestyle protocol that speaks to your unique needs. If you hunger for food freedom, Mindy invites you to a complimentary discovery session. During this powerfully eye-opening conversation, you'll explore the steps that will help you transform the energy of obsession to making lasting and sustainable changes in your life, including your relationship with food and your body. If you're seeking freedom from a relationship with food that's holding you hostage, if you're longing to find your enough, if you're feeling inspired by the possibilities that await you when you create the life you deserve and desire, contact Mindy today. The link to do so is in today's show notes. And I really liked your point as well about perhaps communicating to people that you're not doing well, because sometimes it is hard, isn't it, to communicate through words, or maybe you feel that you've tried to communicate through words, but perhaps people weren't listening, or you didn't feel heard, or you feel really alone and misunderstood. Particularly, I guess, if there's a change in your body, or I think this can work in all kinds of ways, can't it? But I guess the more kind of my typical kind of understanding of this would perhaps be if somebody loses a lot of weight and then they look very unwell, and then people around them then do sort of see that they're struggling, they maybe express more concern, whereas maybe it's been really hard to express that through words for that person, or to get the support and help they needed. Perhaps they felt almost they got drawn down this unhelpful path, I guess, perhaps as the only way to wave that flag in a way that I'm not doing well here.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think both kind of share the similarity of being kind of silent, where when someone's grieving and of course they're going through such a hard time, that person might have this own thought process of it shouldn't be that hard. I should just get over it. It's not that bad. Other people have it worse, and they almost invalidate themselves and therefore silence themselves. And I think that's where eating disorders come in too, as like a silencing method, whether that's restriction, binging, purging, exercising, to also correlate together in that way. So yeah, I definitely agree with you with all that.
Oh, no, it makes a lot of sense. So can you talk, Brooke, a bit more about some of the griefs that someone might experience in recovery? Because I know it's kind of quite multi-layered, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. This kind of first section that we've talked about so far, I think, is like conceptualization and like a little bit more of psychoeducation, where this next part, like the griefs that we notice in recovery, is where I really jive with my clients and doing this type of work. And yeah, this is just a short list, I think, that comes up for clients. There's probably a lot that I'm missing, but the griefs that we notice might be as you've gone through treatment or you've gone through recovery, maybe you're more in this maintenance phase with recovery, is you're reflecting the loss of ourselves. Maybe we lost ourselves to our eating disorder, that we maybe lost like a version of our authentic self to our eating disorder, or that we've recovered and people have done so much great work and progress that they're kind of wondering, well, who am I without my eating disorder? What's my identity without this thing that I thought that helped me, that maybe was there for a while and that no longer serves me? So that might be grief of ourselves, or maybe even grief of the eating disorder. And then acknowledging that this part of us maybe doesn't serve us anymore. And there's also another great book that I like to recommend to clients, Life with Less Eating Disorder, or Life Without the Eating Disorder, I'm so sorry, by Schaefer. That's another really great one that kind of encapsulates eating disorders and grief. So I'll send that to you as well later, because I think that's a great representation for what we're talking about. But just to like carry on with other griefs that we notice, it might be grieving the thin ideal, with looking at our diet culture and the society that we live in, that this is a part of our society that still exists, and that most bodies aren't the thin ideal, and that bodies are unique and individualized. And it might even be grieving the body that we had when we were in our eating disorder, and now that we're recovered and we're feeling so much better and things are going way more our way now. But there is still, I think, that eating disorder that grieves the body that was at that point. Or if someone has gone through treatment, they may have grief of they had to pause work or school to go take care of themselves, and how that's just a loss of time, a loss of months even to go do the thing that they need to do, and no regrets. It's been so helpful, but life changed during that time. Even grief of losing control, like grieving that control and our eating disorder only ends up harming us. So grieving and letting go of that control, even though that's so much harder or easier than said than done. And it might be grieving like our childhood, depending on how we grew up and what our school system, our friend system, our family dynamics were like, that it's grieving that maybe parents or siblings, friends weren't super supportive of us, and grieving a childhood that maybe we didn't get because of the entanglement with diet culture. And there's probably so much more. And that was just kind of a few I had written down so far. But a lot of these, I think clients can, in some way, shape, or form, connect to.
Yeah, it's like multiple griefs, isn't it? And I think just talking about the topic more just makes one realize that actually we're kind of experiencing probably these like micro griefs, aren't we? And mega griefs. It's part of life, isn't it? And I think we just often overlook it. But particularly when you're recovering from an eating disorder, there's so many things that you are kind of letting go of, aren't you? And it's very natural that you will be grieving as part of your healing process.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, this is all very sad. And when we talk about sad things, of course, we get sad. And I also think when we're in those micro or macro griefs, which I love that phrase, that is very, very, very insightful. But when you're in that process and you get to the other side, that side of recovery is so much better because of the beginning where it wasn't so great. And we almost have to grieve and be in that sad to feel better and like have that light and that motivation for recovery.
So, Brooke, can you talk a little bit as well about how you would work with clients when they are going through their grief? Because I guess a lot of it is perhaps like talking therapy, isn't it? As and when things come up, you will sort of explore them. Do you have a particular approach or any kind of skills or techniques that you would specifically use when working with a client?
Yeah, I think it's giving clients really the space to talk and process out these thoughts and feelings. Because, like we said earlier, this is often a concept that isn't talked about maybe when you're in high level of care or treatment, and maybe sometimes you don't when you're in outpatient care. So I think it's just even getting familiar and a lot of psychoeducation about the grief. And it's usually a little bit more feelings focused, I'd say, when we're doing this type of healing process. And the thing that I'll tell clients is trying to really feel your feelings, not just saying or acknowledging the feelings. Like, of course, that's important, but it is getting deeper into feeling those feelings and letting yourself cry, letting yourself be truly expressive. And it's okay if it's messy. It's okay if it doesn't make sense. That's what's been going on really underneath. And I think when you give yourself that permission to really open up and be truly vulnerable that way, it's hard, but it feels really good at the same time. So it's getting there and feeling it in sessions with your therapist, coping skills along the way, those emotion regulation skills along the way. I also think over time, then, as we're, of course, doing psychoeducation with like those stages of grief and whatnot, eventually it gets to that point of acceptance work. So, that acceptance and commitment therapy with clients of accepting this is what happened and this is how you felt and this is the experience that you went through. And here is where it is now. And what can we do about it in the here and now, too, to create this forever beautiful life that you've worked so hard for, that one life that we really get. And as we're doing that, I think it's so important for clients to also have community during this time, because like we said earlier, this can be a lonely and silencing type of journey. So when you have friends and family, loved ones, or sort of group therapy, I think is phenomenal to really be with you throughout this journey and building more back up to yourself and your authentic self while maintaining your recovery, being with your support people and doing all the things that you've wanted to do since like your day one of treatment for recovery. I would say that's more of the treatment model that I do. And knowing that this whole process is nonlinear. There's days where it's a lot harder than others, and there's days where it's a lot easier than others. So riding that wave of what we call life.
And I know many people that struggle with eating disorders are sort of terrified, aren't they, getting in touch with their feelings, and particularly if they're quite painful feelings, and are perhaps really worried that if they open that box almost of feelings, that it's just going to be overwhelming and that feelings are going to get worse and worse. It's going to be unmanageable and out of control and all of the things. What would you say to anyone listening who maybe is really sort of resonating with that thought at the moment?
We've all been there. That is a really real experience. And I think what's also scary in this population that we work with is feeling your feelings without the eating disorder, right? Kind of removing that maladaptive coping and being with yourself and those feelings. And we validate and normalize that it's a totally understandable experience. And let's normalize it. It's human. We have emotions for a reason and they're there for reasons. They signal us and tell us what's going on within us. Our body does the same thing. So to practice giving permission for ourselves, it's okay. Just like if a friend were going through this, we would be unconditional and supportive and positive regard for them as well. So we can for us. It might be challenging some of those kind of distortions too that come up, right? Those areas of thinking that might come up with like shoulding ourselves or judging ourselves, black and white thinking, to maybe go through challenging those distortions and being in the moment with those feelings, trying to stay mindful in the here and now without any judgment, and knowing the feelings come and they will go. And every time that happens, it will get a little bit easier and easier.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's kind of reassuring to hear that, isn't it? Because I think as well, when we've been so blocked off from our feelings for such a long time, particularly when we first start to feel them, we can feel very dysregulated, can't we? And we can feel very, very overwhelmed. And then that can then reinforce the cycle of feeling, well, I just can't deal with my feelings, they're too much. So we block them off again and the cycle repeats. But as you're saying, actually, the more we start to express our feelings and actually be more open, getting in touch with those feelings in the body, they're not so intense, are they? It might take many times of talking about something or getting in touch with a past experience or something. But every time we do that, it will become a little bit easier and we're taking another step, aren't we, towards healing?
Exactly. And it's also, I think, a little bit of human nature of when we're uncomfortable or when things are distressing that we can sometimes avoid first. And what avoidance does, as we know, it comes back in some way. It shows back up in some way. It makes a loop and it's not really going anywhere until we address it. And of course, it's hard. And that's where I think practicing like feeling the feelings with your therapist, as long as you have a really good relationship with your therapist, can be extremely helpful and therapeutic. And yeah, it's going to be a little bumpy road at first, but right, as you said, like the more you practice, you grow to become more comfortable with the uncomfortable, is often what I say, until it becomes a little bit easier for you to even do on your own, that you can feel your feelings and take care of them, take care of yourself, and continue on with your recovery in your day. And of course, some days are going to be easier than others and times are harder, and you keep on going.
Mm-hmm. I guess what's really important as well is because I think obviously what we're talking here about kind of grief and we're thinking about feelings like anger or sadness, perhaps particularly, but actually when we get in touch with our negative feelings around grief, also we can access probably some of our more positive feelings as well. I mean, not that I really like to label feelings negatively and positively, because I think we need all the feelings, don't we, as part of being human. But we can access more as well, can't we? Our joy, our happiness, our contentment as well. We get to experience those feelings as well when we open ourselves up to be able to kind of feel the whole spectrum of feelings.
Totally agree. And something that's really cool with this journey too, as you're in the grieving and healing process, is that I think you become more empathetic and compassionate for yourself, for like that journey that you've been on too, is that you've been maybe in a really hard place and come out the other side, that you have all the perspectives and lenses, that it becomes a lot easier, I think, for one to be more compassionate towards themselves too. And that's also what's really helpful within this process, is to be compassionate with yourself. This is really hard work. This is the underneath the deeper layers of the iceberg. So to give yourself like that grace and compassion, just like you would for anyone else, can be a really valuable skill and tool to use within this journey.
Yeah, and it's so important. Are there any little like rituals or kind of practical things that people might do to help with their grief? Because I'm thinking, I mean, I'm not at all a grief expert actually, but I'm thinking about perhaps when people are dealing with more what I would call conventional grief as a non-grief expert. We're thinking about like losing someone or something. We might create a little kind of memory box. We might do something that really helps us to connect with that kind of grief and that loss and remember that person maybe. But I'm just wondering, like, can that be done in a similar way when you're grieving an eating disorder or aspects related to your eating disorder?
I definitely think so. And I'm not a grief expert either. This is just an area where I'm fairly passionate about. But yes, I think there's lots of ways where you can do more specific interventions that pertain to recovery and grief. And what I'll have clients do, and they often don't like it at first, but they do afterwards because it can feel really cathartic. But I think it's writing and journaling. And that might be writing and grieving to the eating disorder in a way of like saying goodbye, or it might be writing to like your younger self of grieving of what that person went through and what that was like. A little bit of like post-induction kind of therapy of like also that reparenting method, if that's applicable within a client's journey. You could even be writing to future you to instill hope and faith and motivation to keep going. Journaling can be beautiful within that way. I also think you can do art therapy within that too, because if writing's really hard, which it can be, that sometimes creating something without words can feel way more expressive and free. I'll have clients do that too. And it's hard at first. It's often like, well, where do I start? Like, how do I go about this? But once you start going, I think it starts to flow a little bit more. And often I'll tell clients to designate some time for themselves, get themselves half hour, 45 minutes or something like that to do an exercise like this, to really just give yourself the full opportunity to feel your feelings and not have to worry about picking up the kids from school or going back to class or logging on to your next client, that you really have this space just for you. And then you have like a cope ahead plan afterwards. If you're going to spend time with like other people or do some self-care, those are often some interventions I'll do with clients.
Really, really helpful to share. So, Brooke, do you think there's anything else around this kind of grief topic and eating disorders? And I'm sure it's very expansive, so we can really talk all day. But I'm just wondering, is there anything else that you really wanted to bring up, perhaps that we haven't talked about and we've missed?
I think just to give clients permission that no matter what your grief is, that all grief is deserving of therapy and support, and that a therapist will, of course, work with you and validate with you and explore with you. Because, like, this is such a broad topic, but also so individualized when you really get down to it, and that there is hope for all of this, and that it's really hard work to do this type of work. But then again, on the other side, it's really worth it. And what I found with clients too, if they have a community, is that they share this type of work that they do with other clients. And then that itself is validating and therapeutic too. So I would just say, like, to not be alone, find your support people, your community, talk about all of this. And it's okay to have your feelings be what they are. I think it's important for clients to feel so seen and heard when it comes to this. So just to create that space to give clients that opportunity.
They're so helpful. So that real permission slip, isn't it, to explore whatever your personal grief is, to really, and to have the space that to be really validated and heard and understood. And then also to realize actually that when we do this, it means that you can come out the other side and you're much more likely, aren't you, to be sort of fully healed, maybe rather than being stuck in a sort of quasi recovered place where you may have changed some of your behaviors, but you haven't really got in touch with some of this deeper pain.
Absolutely. And that's where therapy, and I also recommend clients still seeing a dietitian during this journey too, just so they can get some additional support as they're navigating through this, especially if it's a client who struggles with feeling their feelings or acknowledgement of their feelings and how maybe those disordered behaviors and feelings coexist. So that's where I think having like your team still in place is really helpful. This happened a while ago, but I had a friend who lost his dad. And of course, we're consoling and grieving and of course apologizing. I'm so sorry for your loss. And he said something that I think is so profound of like, yes, this pain is so painful, but it's this painful because I loved him so much, because the love was so great. So you have to feel the pain to feel the light and to feel the love. I think that's really true. And that's often a little quote I'll share with clients too.
Oh, they're so helpful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
So,
of course.
Brooke, where can people find you if they want to get in touch with you?
Sure. Yeah. So I have a couple ways to contact me. I have an email address. So it's Brooke or B Carlson at therapyservicesmn.com. I also have a phone number as well that clients can call me at, and it's 612-470-8626. And then I also have a personal website for my business, and that's www.brookecarlsontherapyservices.com. So feel free to check out any of those platforms. And if clients want to connect, then they are more than welcome to.
Okay, well, that's fantastic, Brooke. And I shall make sure all the details are in the show notes. And just to confirm, I'm guessing that you have to be in Minnesota, do you, to be able to see you?
Yes, they do. It would be
Yeah.
amazing to see clients from all over the world. But yes, just based on insurance, that they should be in Minnesota to see me. But there's a lot of wonderful clinicians that I work with too at Wholehearted Healing that have also grief experiences. So that's also another way to connect with more resources.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Brooke, for coming back on the podcast again. I think this has been another really helpful, interesting conversation. And I know the listeners are going to really resonate with so many of the things you talked about. So thank you so much.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to being in touch soon.
So I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did. Do go and check out all of Brooke's details in the show notes. If you're not following me already on Instagram, do seek me out, the eating disorder therapist _. And for further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast, I would be so grateful if you'd follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.